Good evening, everyone. I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Rob Alston, and I'm the Community Sport Officer within the City of Casey. Just like to welcome you, obviously, onto the forum tonight. We're going to have a great session, and hopefully we can get a lot of information and things we can implement at our clubs throughout the upcoming 6 to 12 months. I'd just like to do a welcome to country. So the City of Casey proudly acknowledges the Wurundjeri, Boon Wurrung and Bunurong traditional owners, Casey's Aboriginal communities and their rich culture, and pays respect to their elders past, present and future. So as I said, welcome to tonight. This is the third of our instalment of webinars for the year to date, and tonight's topic is financial sustainability, which I hope you all know, otherwise you're probably rocking up not knowing what's going on. I'll just go through a couple of housekeeping matters just to start with. So most of you have done that already, but if you can place your name and club in your description if possible, or in the comments, so just so we know who we've got in the room with us tonight, it would be greatly appreciated. During the presentation, if you just keep your camera and microphone, camera off and microphone muted, just to make sure that the presenters have got all everyone's attention. And if you've got any, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to use the chat function, or if we do get asked to come off mute, please do that at the appropriate time. If you do have a question in relation to something not about tonight, so something to do with your facility or any bills or anything like that, please obviously just leave those to another time, either tomorrow or another opportunity just to touch base on those. Obviously we're here for the specific reason of the presentation and to learn as much as we can over the next hour to hour and a half time. So if you could limit that, that would be much appreciated. And lastly, from myself, we are recording tonight's presentation, obviously to provide opportunities to go back if there's something you might miss, or if you want to just make sure you've caught that really effectively. There's opportunities to do that at a later date. We will send that out as the opportunity allows us to. So just moving into tonight's session, we're very lucky to have Leisure Networks along with us this evening again. So just a reminder, Leisure Networks is a regional sports assembly operating in the Barwon region. They provide volunteer support, information, training and development opportunities to local clubs. They also support by working with community and recreation sector to create inclusive opportunities for people with a disability as a registered NDIS provider. As you can see, we've got Jesse here from Leisure Networks. He's the coordinator of community development at Leisure Networks and works across the Geelong and Greater Melbourne areas to develop and deliver existing and new programs for clubs, associations and government. We'll also have someone from Council, Kristen Sweeney, along a little bit later in the evening, just to provide some information from a council perspective on grants and other opportunities that will hopefully help assist clubs as they go along, and will definitely relate to a lot of the stuff that the guys are going to talk about tonight. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jesse and he can introduce our special guests and get the night underway. Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, Robert, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third session in our City of Casey Club Development Series, tonight's session being on financial sustainability. Before we start, I'm also going to do an acknowledgement to country from our side of things. So I wish to begin by acknowledging the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which I am presenting from today. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land you're all listening in from, and I wish to pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Before we get into the main content of the night, what I want to do is similar to what we've been doing through the chat function. I actually want to get a bit of an understanding as to the audience we've got with us. So what I'd like you to do, and I'm going to share my screen once we get some answers rolling through. I'd love to know what your position is at the club if you haven't already included in the chat function. And secondly, what's your level of financial literacy? And again, there's no right or wrong answers to any of this. We're all here to learn tonight, regardless of what background we have in terms of our knowledge of finances. But if you can please just put in the chat function, firstly your position and then your level of financial literacy. And we're going to write it down as a bit of a group document that we're going to work through tonight. If you'd prefer to, again, take yourself off mute and quickly talk to the group, but more than welcome to do so as well, if you'd prefer to do that instead of chucking the chat function. So we got
So
Brett.
it's Vaughan from Clyde Tennis Club. Just where do I put this information in the chat function? Where do you do that?
Yep. So on the top left-hand top corner of the screen, you should see basically a speech bubble. And if you click on that, you'll be able to see a chat box. Again, if you can't see it, there's not a problem at all. We're more than happy to talk it through. And if you want to just take yourself off mute and answer the question as well, that's fine.
All right, I might do that.
Yep. So Vaughan, what's your position and
So
level of financial literacy, I guess?
Okay, so I'm the treasurer at the Clyde Tennis Club.
Excellent. And experience, I guess, in financial management or financial understanding?
I was in banking and finance for 35 years.
Oh, there we go. Excellent.
Is there any other information you need?
No, that's great to start with. We're getting some answers coming through as well. So we've got Shane's a secretary at Marinda Park Cricket Club, has been in the treasurer's role for 20 years ago. Leanne's secretary and treasurer from Hallen Tennis Club, I think has a fairly good handle on finances, but always happy to learn more, which is fantastic. Paris is the treasurer at the Hallen Football Club, medium understanding. Brett Theodore's president and has high interest. Excellent. I've been noting all these down in a document that we're going to be able to share as a group later on. But again, it's just really good for us to get an understanding of what we've got in the room, who we've got in the room tonight, and yeah, your understanding of financial basics and literacy information. We've got Dot. This is softball treasurer. Excellent. David Anning, secretary and treasurer at Endeavour Hills Cricket Club. High understanding. That's fantastic. Give it about another 30 seconds and then I'm going to pass over to our guest presenters for tonight. Just if you haven't had a chance to either take yourself off mute and answer the question or chuck it in the chat function, if you could just do so before we get started. Dawn, president of Casey Comets Football Club, 5 years on the committee, 10 years financial, learned through club involvement. So basically that's excellent. Thanks, Dawn. Five years president and 10 years on the committee. Excellent. All right, what I might do, as I said, if you're still answering the question, by all means, just keep writing it in the chat function. But to kickstart tonight's session, I'm going to introduce our guest presenters tonight. So we're lucky enough to have Beau and Lachlan from More Australia. At Leisure Networks, we've worked really closely with More Australia for a number of years, and they do some fantastic work helping sports community clubs in a range of different areas. And we've done a lot of work, especially in the last 12 months, through a lot of club development sessions like tonight, helping clubs better understand how they can financially be in a great position going forwards and how they can manage their club. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Lachlan and Beau.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It's good to see a lot of people are already on the chat function. So throughout our presentation, we've got a number of points where we take a stop and pause and just ask people if they've got any questions. So again, if you prefer the microphone, happy to take yourself off mute and ask any questions you might have. Or if you're not too keen to take off get on the microphone, please use the chat function. One of us will be monitoring it as we go. But yeah, during those stop and pauses, we find that they are where some clubs can get a bit more, I guess, practical application on how certain things we speak about might apply to their club. So some of the topics we're covering today, we sort of got to cater for a large variety of clubs. So, you know, it could be a club turning over 500,000 with pokie machines and employees, or it could be a club with, you know, no pokies, you know, less than 100 members and not turning over a great deal. So if you ever are wondering how it applies to your club or how the suggestion or recommendation might apply to your club, please let us know, and we can probably try and contextualize it a little bit for you. So the outline of the session today is I'll give a bit of an introduction as to who Locke and I are and what we do, I guess, with More Stevens and Leisure Network. But the theme of today's session is around financial sustainability, but also financial viability. So that's going to be the first point we touch on, and just what the tipping point is for clubs, particularly during the current COVID crisis. We've had a number of one-on-one coaching sessions with clubs and done a number of these presentations. So we've got a lot of feedback from clubs. So I guess that's probably where we want to start. And then the rest of the session is really just focusing on tools and strategies that clubs can take away to, I guess, try and remain financially viable, and also monitoring that just to know where the trigger points are, where the club might be running into issues. So that's basically the outline of the session. So we talk about financial viability, we talk about strategies for staying financially sustainable, and Locke will take us through some basics of just learning how to read the financial reports, and what level of financial reporting that we generally see within clubs. We're going to have a chat about some alternative income streams, as well as engaging and keeping sponsors. So I'd like to get a lot of feedback from clubs during those sessions, share their, I guess, experiences or strategies they've put in place, particularly throughout COVID, because sponsors is probably the number one challenge people have had keeping during the COVID period. And then we're going to close off just by, I guess, some strategies for managing the club's finances. So that's going to be, the reporting capability within the club, as well as some internal financial controls and looking at that financial control environment, just so the committee has, I guess, some comfort in the numbers that are being presented to them, and not just relying on that treasurer function to provide that assurance to them. And then, as mentioned previously, so we'll have some question time again at the end, but then also the City of Casey is going to just run us through some of their grant opportunities that they've got coming up or currently available. So Locke, if you just go to the next slide. So just as a bit of an introduction on, I guess, More Australia, as well as Locke and myself. So More is a global brand, and it's got about 266 member firms across 112 countries worldwide. So we're a part of the More Australia network brand. So we're made up of 4 offices across 6 states and territories. The services provided by More Australia include tax advisory, debt, CFO service offerings, audit and assurance, and as Jesse's recently touched on, we now provide financial coaching services to a number of sporting clubs. So Locke and I guess, just speaking from our background, so I've come from an audit background myself, but now I'm part of the business advisory team, and as part of that audit background, I did a number of financial statement audits for a number of clubs around the Geelong region. So could vary from cricket club, bowls clubs, golf clubs. A lot of them had poker machines, so a lot of them required audit based on their turnover. And I've also got a bit of a background on I sit on a subcommittee for a sporting organisation as well. And Locke's background, so Locke works with me, and he specialises in our tax and CFO service offering, and Locke's also got a background in sitting as treasurer for his local basketball association for 2 years. So I guess the topic of today is just around financial viability, and what that means for clubs in terms of staying financially viable. So when I talk about financial viability is the ability to generate sufficient income to meet the operating payments, and while still allowing for growth within the club. So during the COVID pandemic, that tipping point for a number of clubs has really been when income streams have dried up. So, sponsors are pulling out, members are pulling out, and they just don't have adequate cash reserves to meet ongoing payments. And it's been particularly the case where the club hasn't been able to, I guess, put a hold on any cash outflows. So they haven't been able to defer the payment. They've got repairs and maintenance that still needs to be ongoing despite the lack of income coming in. Or it could be that they've invested in equipment or sports uniforms that they've paid for in advance, and then they were looking to sell once the season started, but then obviously the season hasn't gone ahead, and they're left holding those assets without the cash. So another term we'll also talk about today is what a going concern is. And now for a club, a going concern is the club's ability to meet its financial obligations as they fall due. So in the current operating environment, the going concern is the biggest risk for a number of clubs, particularly those where they don't have cash reserves to keep them afloat. So I guess the purpose of today's session is we're going to look at tools and strategies for clubs to maintain their going concern by remaining financially viable. And effectively, that's what that diagram on the screen's illustrating there. So the risk at the moment a lot of clubs are facing is quite a big risk, and that's going concern. And how we mitigate that risk or reduce it is by reducing the likelihood of it. And that's what we're going to try and go through today, is some strategies and controls for reducing the likelihood of having going concern issues in the future. So some strategies that we're going to cover off on today is looking at cash flow forecasting and reporting. And again, we've got a few examples to go through, but it's really got to be strategies that are fit for purpose for the club. So, we're not talking about large models that, the treasurer has to maintain in his own time. We're trying to look at simple solutions that the club can put in place to sort of just get a bit of oversight as to the financial health of the club. Another strategy we're going to look at is monitoring spend and building cash reserves, deferring avoidable costs, negotiating payment terms with suppliers, diversifying revenue streams, as well as engaging with sponsors. So Locke, you're going to take us through staying financially sustainable.
Thanks for that, Bo. So just sort of touching on from what Bo said, you can sort of look at financial viability as sort of being financially sustainable. So I guess the very first starting point is how can we remain or stay financially sustainable in the first place? And sort of 4 strategies we want to look at include understanding our financial statements, preparing an annual budget, looking at some cash flow fundamentals, and also looking at how we can diversify or maintain our current revenue streams. So the very first thing we sort of want to look at is understanding our annual financial statements. Now, we sort of take the perspective with a lot of sporting clubs that you're normally set up as an incorporated association, which means you sort of prepare and report your annual financial statements to Consumer Affairs Victoria. One of the things we've noticed with a lot of clubs is sort of the understanding that, although I understand as with Consumer Affairs, you pretty much sort of don't have to submit your financial template itself, but you fill out online and just fill out your figures. But there are actually a couple of requirements that you must include in your financial statements itself. So the very first one is sort of your profit and loss for your association's financial year, which we'll go through in a second, your balance sheet as at the end of the financial year, and then a cash flow statement. So it's usually the cash flow statement that we see a lot of clubs don't include in their financial statements or aren't aware that must be included sort of under the Consumer Affairs Victoria guidelines. And then the very final thing is sort of your notes to your accounts, which kind of includes your information explaining how you've prepared your financial statements, additional content in your profit and loss and balance sheet, and also information required by the provision of the Consumer Affairs Victoria Act. So the first thing we want to sort of look at is the profit and loss in detail. So up on the screen is sort of just a template, which is actually ripped from the Consumer Affairs website. And sometimes you'll also see it referred to as the income statement. The very first top line is sort of your income, which is your amounts generated from the day-to-day operations of the club. For example, for a lot of you guys, it'd be your playing membership fees, maybe some interest you have on a bank account, your bar or canteen sales, etc. Moving down from there, you've got your expense line. So these are your amounts incurred in order to operate the club on a day-to-day basis. So really there, we're looking at things like rent of your sporting grounds, match payments to players, umpire payments, fees to your account, subscriptions, insurance, etc. Those are really your kind of things. The reason your profit and loss can be so important and probably you really need to understand and look at is you can see how your club's performed for the year. So the very first thing is, especially if you've got a budget in place, you can kind of turn around and compare it and see how you're performing. So say you're expecting, especially if you've got the comparatives, you had a good year last year, COVID might have mucked it up a bit, but 60, 70 grand, and then you notice revenue for this year coming out of COVID is a lot less. You might suddenly be sort of a turning point to go, well, even though COVID restrictions are gone, how come our membership fees are down? Or how come our bar sales or canteen sales down? So it can really be a quick analysis to look at how things are. Especially in the expense section too, we notice a lot of things can quickly be identified where sort of expenses that the club haven't accounted for have been incurred. Things like insurance payments being a lot higher than you expected, or player payments being above the salary cap, or things like that. So they're really things we're looking for in the profit and loss. After the profit and loss, you've got your balance sheet. Once again, we sort of popped an example from Consumer Affairs on the screen. And the very first thing you start off with is your assets. So your assets, a lot of clubs you got to think of are the things that provide a future benefit to your club. For example, your sporting equipment, your club rooms, your kitchen equipment, your pile warmers, etc. From your assets, then you've got your liabilities. So these are basically the things your club owes to other parties. For example, a bank loan. Now, what your balance sheet does, it actually splits your assets and liabilities between current and non-current. Basically, the way to look at it is your current assets or liabilities are things that are going to occur within the next 12 months. So, for example, if you've got a bank loan, the next 12 months repayments would be considered a current liability. However, if you had a balloon payment on that you didn't have to pay for 3 years down the track, that would actually be classed as a non-current liability. Once you sort of take away your assets and liabilities, the thing you're left with is called equity. So this is basically your profit or loss reserve that the club has generated through its historical performance. A lot of the time, you'd really want to see this as a sort of positive figure on the balance sheet, and sort of what Bo was talking about with your going concern is where your equity starts to fall into a negative figure. Once again, your balance sheet really is a useful tool to sort of help with your analysis of how your club is performing. One of the biggest, quickest ways you can look at is sort of look at your current assets versus your current liabilities, just to see if you've got enough sort of assets, which includes your things like your bank accounts, to get you through the next 12 months of what you owe.
Lockie, just before you continue on, I just thought I'd just quickly, has anyone got any queries on, I guess, any of these terms that have been discussed, or is everyone comfortable in terms of the understanding of what these phrases that Lachlan and Bo are talking about? Dawn, if you've got a question, Dawn, by all means, if you want to take yourself off mute and ask it.
Yes, it says on here, about loans. Can incorporated associations or clubs obtain loans?
Bo, you might be best to answer that question.
I'd have to double check, but generally with incorporated associations, we generally don't see loans. I mean, they certainly have credit cards, but in terms of financial debt, we usually don't see large amounts of borrowings.
All right, I was just looking at sort of maybe consolidation kind of loans. That's what I was thinking.
Consolidation loans. Sorry, do you mean like related party loans or ones with actual banks?
Well, with whatever really. But it's just, I was just surprised to see loans on there, thinking that as an incorporated association we couldn't actually get loans.
Yeah, generally, I mean, I've never seen an incorporated association, or depending on how the clubs function, I haven't seen an incorporated association that's a sporting club with a loan. I've certainly seen other incorporated associations, I believe, with loan facilities, but it's more, I guess, around how the business is structured. So when I say incorporated association, it could be a not-for-profit organisation as well. So specifically for a sporting club, I haven't seen any loans, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions before the boys continue on with the content? Again, if there's any questions or queries, if you feel free to put them in the chat function, or if you want to, again, take yourself off mute. Comment here from Leanne, our club is very basic, very limited income streams, just membership and grants, no loans or liabilities, no employees, so pretty easy.
Yeah, so I guess that is very easy, I guess, in terms of reporting. One thing I wanted to mention just whilst we are paused is when we're going through this I guess is just setting us up for when we more get to the section that I'll talk about, is in terms of the reporting function. So I guess a lot of committee members won't have much of an understanding as to the reports being presented. So this is, I guess, a bit of a high level background as to what those reports, I guess the background of those reports are. So when I think of the profit and loss, I always think of financial performance. So how is the club performing? And that's where like Lachlan mentioned, we're always doing that year-on-year analysis or comparing budget versus actuals. So it's really looking at current year, how are we improving? Are we growing? Are we growing members? Are we growing sales? All that type of stuff. When we look at the balance sheet, I always think financial health. So, how healthy is the club? Do we have a lot of cash reserves? are members slow in paying us, which is why we're building up this debtor balance, or or the liabilities. Are we struggling to meet payments with suppliers? So that's just some things to think about when we are going through this, because this will sort of flow into our management reporting section that we discuss. But in terms of very basic is good. But I think there's still going to be a level of, I guess, reporting within that club, or, as a committee, if I was a committee member, even if the club was basic, I'd still want to know how we're going. And if we are basic now, what's stopping us from, I guess, growing in the future? And, what do we have in place now to, I guess, monitor that growth?
Excellent. Back to you, Lachlan and Bo.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, guys. So I guess the next statement we're really looking at now is that statement of cash flows. And this is actually one of the most critical statements, I think, sort of in terms of how your club is performing. Because at the end of the day, this report up on the screen basically spits out whether or not your club is generating profit, like positive cash flows during the year, or negative cash flows. So what we're really talking about there is, if you're generating positive cash flows, you're really looking at the end of the year, your bank balances actually grow. Whereas if you've got negative cash flows, you're starting to lose cash and it's going out the door. So the way a statement of cash flows is usually presented is split into three sort of sectors. So at the top, you've got your cash from operating activities. So basically this just spits out your cash earned or spent during the day-to-day operations of your club. For example, your player payments and membership income, etc. So it's a great way just to sort of see, are you generating enough income from your memberships, your sponsorships, etc., to cover your match payments, your insurance, your daily expenses, and all those kind of things. The next line is probably not a lot that you'll see with a lot of clubs, but it's your investing activities. So this is sort of the cash you've spent on purchasing long-term assets, or your cash received from selling one of those long-term assets. For example, you fit out of your club rooms, some sporting equipment that you keep for your players, etc., those kind of things. And then finally, you've got your finance activities. Really, this is probably another one you won't really see a lot. As discussed, not a lot of clubs have loans or sort of high interest earning bank accounts, but it's basically the cash the club has used to service debt obligations and the cash received from the club from debt providers. For example, loan repayments or proceeds from a bank. But I think the most critical thing for you to sort of look at if you do prepare a statement of cash flows is really that operating activities. Really making sure that you're generating positive cash flows from your membership receipts and making sure you're covering your daily expenses. Just before I move on to the slide from next one, do we have any questions? Perfect. So the next thing, sort of strategy we're going to talk about now is sort of preparing an annual budget. So basically the way I kind of think of an annual budget is sort of you're preparing and forecasting what your profit and loss is going to be for the next period. So really what you want to do is there's two ways to prepare your budget. You can either prepare it on a profit basis, which is sort of what I just talked about, or on a cash basis. A cash basis basically just looks at it as if what cash are we going to bring in the next 12 months or for your forecasted period, and what cash are we going to have go out the door for the next 12 months. Your forecasted period, I normally refer to a budget, especially for clubs, is sort of on an annual basis for 12 months, but you can have it 3 months, 6 months, 24 months, whatever you want. We really find that sort of that niche 12-month spot is probably perfect for incorporated associations. You're preparing it just before the start of your next financial year, and you don't have to do it on a quarterly basis or anything like that. Your third one is sort of understanding and documenting your budget assumptions. On the next slide, I'm sort of going to go through an example and can discuss further what these assumptions are. But basically, it's when you prepare your budget, you sort of just make note of, why you predicted revenue to be what it is, or why you predicted certain expenses to go the way they are. And then another point to consider is sort of a lot of the time your budget, especially if it's on a profit basis, won't count for things such as your capital projects, because these are things that would hit your balance sheet. So whether or not you're going to have the cash, to pay for a fit out to your club rooms, etc. And the final one, especially at the moment with you preparing your strategic plans, is whether or not the budget you've prepared aligns with the club strategy going forward. So if your club strategy was to grow memberships or increase sponsorship, if your budget's not reflecting that, it's probably a good point to stop and review what's going on.
Just out of interest for those clubs in the room tonight, do any prepare budgets currently, or can we get an understanding of who does this at present? And again, no right or wrong answer on this one. It's all part of what we're learning tonight. But if anyone out there that does prepare a budget currently. Yep, we've got Clyde prepares a budget. From Ben. We've got a few, excellent. Is anyone comfortable, I guess, before we move into it, to just talk through their experience with setting a budget? Ben, potentially. Ben, are you comfortable to quickly talk through, I guess, the process from your club from setting a budget and potentially even the timelines on when you set it?
Yeah, so we've just done our, we've just had our AGM. We've lodged our consumer affairs stuff, and members of the new committee are just coming on board now.
Yep.
Yep. So yeah, we're halfway through sitting down now, going over, expected membership that's coming in, estimating what we're looking at sponsorship wise, going over. I think we've got 3 years of half decent financial figures for bar sales, etc.
Fantastic.
The stable incomes for the club, and then obviously the expenditure, payer payments, council fees of kind of an average over the last 3 years, etc.
Yep.
Bills and etc. Balls is normally a pretty big one. It's normally up there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I did a stock take the other day on balls, etc., to see where we can save some money and stuff there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we are we are fortunate enough to have a pretty decent membership base. So
yeah, that's fantastic. Excellent. So that's a good example, I guess, from one of the clubs that do it. Yeah, we've had quite a few other clubs that are coming through in the comments as well, saying that they prepare a budget. Some don't, but there's a few that do, which is fantastic. Back to you, Lachlan. Sorry.
That's right. Thanks for that, Jesse. It is great to sort of see. We normally get a mixed bag with clubs, but it is great to see, a few clubs have prepared a budget. For those clubs that probably don't, it's probably something we would really consider just even sitting down and looking at. Like I said, it only has to be once a year. And it can be something as simple as what's up on the screen. So basically, this is sort of just an Excel template that you're looking at up on the screen. And at the top, this is prepared on a profit and loss basis. You've got your income, so what you're sort of expecting to receive in the next 12 months. So what we're really looking at the top line here is you've got your membership fees, and sort of here we've got our $15,000. Now down below are these assumptions that I was talking about before. So in these assumptions sort of jots down how I come up with the figures in this budget. So noted in the assumptions, we're sort of saying, well, our membership fees are going to be similar to last year, and we expect to receive half of them before the start of the financial year. We're a club coming out of COVID. We understand players probably don't have the cash at the moment, so we just expect them to pay half their fees up front and then half by the midway of the season. And then underneath, we've got sort of our gate fees. So for your footy clubs, netball clubs, cricket clubs, etc., you're really looking at, sort of what your average attendance is across the season and just basically spreading it out of what you're going to charge for gate fees to come in the door. And then underneath there, we've got our bar sales as well, which again, probably based on historical performance. You're really looking at your number of head coming in, how much you expect them to spend. Once you've sort of got your income knuckled down, you move on to your expenses. Now, a big one for your expenses is a lot of the time you can kind of look back on last year and see how you went. So things like your council rent, your insurances, you probably expect them to be pretty similar, except maybe increase depending on the CPI or something like that. A big one's probably for a lot of clubs with player payments or umpire payments, etc., especially your league affiliation fees, is really making sure they're catered for within your budget. And then small things like your medical supplies, your tapes, things like Ben was talking about, like your balls, if you're a club that loses balls, all these little things that you need to be picked up and sort of thought about and predicted for the next 12 months. And once you've pulled that all together, what you can really look at is how you expect, your club to perform within 12 months and from a month-to-month basis. So one of the first things you can quickly look at is in January here, we're actually expecting the club not to have any income at all, except it's still got expenses it's got to pay for. So this is really where a budget can help with future planning. So for this first month, this fake club here would have to make sure it's at least got $3,500 in the bank to get it through its first month starting off. Then obviously once the season kicks off, money's rolling through the door in player fees, gate fees, etc. Everything's nice until the season finishes. And then once again, we're in that period where the club's got no revenue because there's no players playing and they're not playing in a season, but your things like your council rents, your insurances, your subscriptions, etc. are still coming through the door that you need to pay. Do we have any quick questions on that before we move on? No.
Thought I might just jump in there, Locke. So back on that slide, so when I was mentioning earlier about going concern being a risk for clubs, and this, I guess, is one of the key strategies for monitoring that. So effectively, what Locke's been talking about is if you're presenting this on a cash basis, and which a lot of clubs do, then effectively those net income amounts or net loss amounts down the bottom should effectively be your cash surplus or deficit for that period. So when we're talking about going concern, do we have the ability to pay our bills into the future? This is, I guess, one of the key controls for, I guess, monitoring that. So if you were to put your cash balance at the start of this model and then add those months together, it should nearly give you your estimated or expected running cash balance for the period. And then that would tell us, how much cash we've actually got for the forecast period, particularly, in this example, where our season ends, we've got 4 months effectively where we've got cash outflows. Can we actually fund that, or do we have to pull some levers now to try and enhance our cash reserves to fund us or float us through that period?
Perfect, thanks, Bo. So moving on sort of from our financial statements, we're touching on what Bo really just talked about there and sort of modelling your cash flow. So as Bo said, you can really use your budget, especially if it's prepared on a cash basis, to sort of model what your next 12 months is with your cash inflows and outflows. Then moving on from there, if you sort of notice where you've got those 4 periods where you're down revenue, or you notice a period where you're going to really struggle for cash, it's sort of how you can manage that. So a couple of suggestions we've seen from other clubs is how you can defer or suspend your costs. So is there a way, especially during COVID, whether your league affiliates ask for the membership fees up front, whether you can see if they could delay them to mid-season, whether you can organise, especially during COVID when you didn't have players, with council to push back rent or defer rent, sort of those kind of things to do. Then from there, it's sort of you're building your cash reserves for growth. So when you look at that budget and you notice you've got your hot periods during the season where you've got plenty of cash running through the door because you've got players out in the field, cash is coming in through the bar, canteen sales, sponsorship, etc. How you can make sure you retain a lot of that cash to get you through those periods where you probably don't have as much income coming through the door, yet you've still got those expenses. And then moving from there, it's making sure you've got your appropriate delegations. One of the biggest things we notice, especially, and we understand it's really difficult with small sporting clubs, is ensuring sort of there's always multiple eyes across financial transactions. You want to make sure, the right people who have access to the funds are using it for the right purposes and in the club's best benefit. So that's really one way to make sure. And you don't want, especially if you know there's sort of a negative period coming up, you don't want someone going haphazard and buying all this sporting equipment, even though you need those cash reserves to get you through those down periods. And I guess finally is sort of deferring memberships. This was a big one we noticed during COVID, especially when a lot of members, you had a lot of players probably ask whether or not, they can have their membership fee refunded. Obviously, that's going to hurt you from a cash flow perspective if you have to give that cash back and you've still got expenses, because your membership fees are one of your biggest revenues. So whether or not you're able to negotiate deferrals with your members and get them sort of, instead of returning their 2021 fee, we'll pass it on to 2022, or we'll give you another half season next year for free. So we just want to quickly throw it back to you guys. How did clubs go with their members in terms of deferrals and refunds, etc.?
And again, if anyone would prefer to take themselves off mute to answer that question, you're more than welcome to.
Yeah, hi, I'm Fran Ashenden from Endeavour Hills. We
Hi,
only
Fran.
had a very small number of people who paid their fees by the time that COVID hit last year. So it was sort of right at the start of our season, and usually we have to pull people kicking and screaming to pay their fees. So we only had a few that had paid in full, and all of those except about 2 said that they would just carry it over for this year. So yeah, we were okay in that respect.
Excellent. Dawn, you've got your hand up again. If Dawn, you want to take yourself off mute and answer that question as well?
Hi. We had planned, well, we're soccer, so come under Football Victoria. We had estimated around 600 players. We'd ordered all the kits, got everything ready, and then obviously we went into lockdown just before. Only about 15 to 20% of our members had paid their fees, but we still had all the expense and the registration fees to our association. Of the 20% that did pay, I would say 50% are requesting their money back, and 50%, well, we offered everybody a credit rollover, and about 50% accepted the credit rollover. So this year we've started off with less players, and obviously a lot of those are not paying fees because we had to roll over. So it's put us in a very sort of precarious situation trying to manage this, and we were astounded how many actually wanted refunds. So we're having to manage them as we go along. You just cannot refund everybody, or as many that, you know, we're having to stagger how we pay people back.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Dawn. I'll just a couple that I'll read through that are coming in on the comments as well. So Vaughan Smith at Clyde Tennis Club offered 50% discount on the 2021 season. Our club is currently under redevelopment, so we have no club courts or clubhouse until late to early 2022. And they use Cranbourne as our base, and we'll be funding them for access until they resettle. What else have we got here? Leanne, we only charged 50% membership fees for last year, and everyone appreciated the offer and paid quickly. We were lucky and didn't lose any members or have many expenses. We were not playing in any comp. So there's a couple that are coming through just from the comments.
Thanks, Jesse. I'll hand over to Bo to sort of start discussing other ways we can bring in diversified revenue streams.
Yeah, thanks, Locke and Jesse. Yeah, so just to some of those points, I mean, particularly where we are having, I guess, a bit of that decline in expected member numbers. Again, that cash flow budget will aid organisations in modelling that and what the impact will be on the club. So, you know, if initially you did come into the season with a budget of 600 members and, you know, we're only looking at 300, modelling that and, you know, working out what that means for the club and what the impact will be key, particularly when it comes to looking at some of those costs associated with, I guess, the playing season and whether or not the club can put those off or, you know, enter into different trade terms with some of those suppliers. So I guess what I wanted to touch on was, I guess, some alternative income streams. And again, want to get, we've got a number of clubs on the session tonight, a lot of different clubs, different sports being played. So I want to get a lot of input from this, just give, I guess, other clubs and other organisations some ideas that they may not be currently implementing. So I guess one that we had on there, after discussing or having one-on-one sessions with a number of clubs, we found that a lot of clubs still don't offer food and beverage, I guess, services at their facilities. And some of the reasons can be that they just don't have liquor licenses or they don't offer catering facilities there. And what we'll have a chat about, I guess, sponsors and what sponsors can provide in terms of in-kind sponsorship avenues. So where we talk about them providing food to the club in lieu of sponsorship. But one thing we've found is, yeah, a lot of clubs are currently looking at getting liquor licenses in order to provide that service. So they're currently investigating, you know, avenues of getting that licensing and what it means for their club. The hire of the sporting facilities and club rooms was another one that we chatted about with a number of clubs. Now, there is, I guess, a bit of a clubs need to do their research in terms of what they are allowed to do with the facilities. So generally it comes back to the lease agreement with council if council owns the grounds. A lot of the time we see some clubs aren't allowed to, you know, provide or lease out those facilities just purely because of how that lease is arranged with the club. So if it is one avenue that is available to your club, recommend looking into it by looking at that lease arrangement that's currently in place. Community programs and clinics. We've had clubs that have had guest speakers come to the facility, or they've had Zoom sessions where a guest speaker will jump on Zoom. So that's been one, I guess, alternative to raising revenue during the COVID crisis, is having those, I guess, non-contactable events still. So other things were like online trivia, Zoom trivia that clubs were having, not just, I guess, having club members there, but also having people from the community join those sessions.
Just on that, Bo, I was just going to mention as well, some of the discussions that we have, even around the participation side of things, and I'm sure a lot of you would heard about the doing sport differently model, and effectively what that is saying is that what you would typically do as a club, what can you potentially do to adapt kind of your on-field or on-court participation opportunities to potentially open yourselves up to a new range of participants, and we talked about that as part of the growing your club in the first session. So thinking back to that as well within this context is you might have a great number of participants or members that are involved in your club for a particular participation opportunity, but what could you potentially do, whether it's modified sports, whether it is a come and try day, whether it is, so there's a lot of like walking netball, walking basketball, there's a lot of different kind of participation opportunities you could potentially look to put on that could open you up to another revenue stream through a whole new kind of participation avenue. So when we're talking about community programs and clinics as well, have a think about that sort of things within that context as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jesse. And then the other point I had there was just around providing assistance with community events. So I recall back in my footy playing days, our club used to engage with an event management organisation that was, they were organising triathlons around the Great Ocean Road. And effectively what our club would do is hire out volunteers from the club to assist on the day. And what it means for the event organiser is that they don't have to pay, I guess, employees to perform those roles. But then on the other hand, I believe our club was getting something like $100 per player for the day. So just different ways like that to sort of get, yeah, I guess, different income in. So the next slide I had was just around grant funding. So again, City of Casey is going to touch on some local grant funding opportunities that clubs can apply for. But I guess what I wanted to touch on here was just some other avenues of grant funding that is available. So we've got the Sports and Recreation Victoria, so up on their website, as well as Vic Health. There's always grant opportunities going. So the key thing for clubs is, I guess, committees just having that person that is delegated for staying abreast of, you know, what grants are out there, and it's monitoring sites like those where you'll get the greatest opportunity. So if there is that one person within the committee that is delegated that responsibility, they can bring those to those meetings on an ongoing basis. And that's where you can start getting those grant applications drafted and submitted.
I'll say on that so quickly, Bo, that Vic Sport have a fantastic website that is dedicated to a lot of different grant opportunities. So I'll include that within the resources that get sent out after tonight, but it's a page that lists available grants at any given time from a range of different sites that can help community clubs.
The next point I had was just around engaging and keeping sponsors. So as mentioned previously, memberships is a key one that people have been struggling to keep during COVID, but sponsors are another one. So obviously you've got the businesses that are hit hard. The last thing they're wanting to do is outlay more cash. So it's looking at ways in which we can manage those relationships and keep sponsors on board. So again, coming back to, I guess, the structure of the committee, you know, it's who's delegated the responsibility of engaging with those sponsors, you know, making sure we can keep them not only engaged with the club, but also getting some sort of, I guess, financial benefit to help support the club. So some considerations when selling, I guess, sponsorship packages, and I want to get, I guess, some club input here as to, or some of the clubs, what they've been experiencing with sponsors. But I guess some suggestions we had was in terms of how we sell those packages to sponsors, particularly, you know, if we've got recurring sponsorships or if we're trying to get new sponsors on board, is what the sales pitch is when we are engaging with those sponsors. So the key one that I always think of is foot traffic, particularly if you're trying to sell signage at the club facilities or around the ground. And that's not only foot traffic within the club. So, you know, your club might only have 30 members. So, and this is what a takeaway from one of the one-on-one sessions I had with the club was they only had 30 to 45 members in a year. So sponsorship wasn't really something that they focused on at their club as like an alternative revenue stream. But then I asked them, I guess, how many other clubs are coming to use your facilities throughout the year? And I believe they had something like 10 clubs coming through their doors throughout the year, and with an average of 30 to 40 players as well coming through the club. So, you know, just there, you've got another 400 people or 400 participants or foot traffic coming through that club. So it's just, I guess, tailoring the pitch a little bit to sponsors, you know, to try and give them, you know, a bit more bang for their buck when we are trying to sell sponsorship packages to clubs. Another, I guess, avenue for selling sponsorship is just around what incentives there are for the sponsor. So, you know, does the club have specific events where, you know, sponsors might be able to put up some displays or come and speak at club events? There could be special mentions on club promotional material. And then the point I mentioned earlier was just around in-kind sponsorship avenues. So whilst businesses are impacted due to COVID, you know, cash outlay is probably the last thing they're thinking of doing. So there could be other ways that clubs or sponsors could support clubs and still get that sponsorship whilst providing benefit to the club. And a few suggestions we had there was just around food contributions. So providing dinners on a certain night for the club. It could be donating vouchers, sporting equipment, or having prize vouchers for after the club's games. So the next slide here, we just had an example of a local club from Geelong and what they were doing with their sponsor. So on the left is a copy of the Barwon Club Hotel menu for their Palmy night. So what they're doing with their Palmy nights is $5 from every Palmy sold is going back to the South Barwon Football Netball Club. So that's one good way of, I guess, having that diversified income stream. You know, that's not cash that the sponsor's having to outlay all at once. It's you know, they outlay that cash once they actually sell those Palmies and get that cash in the door. So that was one interesting way. Another one is the Melbourne Ice team. They've got a sponsor, the Wanderling Chef. So they're just advertising that sponsor on their social media websites.
Is there any, just before we jump on the next one, and Bo mentioned before, are there any examples from any of the clubs with us tonight on ways that you potentially use some innovation to engage and keep sponsors during COVID, or what you're looking to do now? Paris, I think you've just put your hand up.
Yeah, so this year actually was the most sponsors we've actually gained. So I only came on, I've been a part of a football club like for, I'd say 7 years, but only on the committee this year. But this year was the most year that the club has gained sponsors, which is funnily enough, really. The way we sort of did it was we gave them an incentive. So we had different tiers of sponsorship. So 500, 1,000 and 2,000. And then we had like our major sponsors, which were jumper sponsors. And there was one hospitality venue that wanted to basically give us, they were throwing us money. So we advertise all of our clubs on social media, and we work really close with Gameface as well. So they produce all of our social media and, you know, do videos for the sponsors that we do have. And then we also have banners displayed around our football ground of the sponsors, you know, logo, contact details, etc. So yeah, we're pretty big on the sponsorship incentives when we do get the sponsors. We also had ones like Reese Plumbing. They gave vouchers, and we use those vouchers for either sporting equipment, like for training drills, or we use it for like best on grounds every Thursday night. So from the week before, we generally give like a $50, $30 and $20 voucher, and they come from sponsors. So like, as I said, Reese did Rebel Sport because they physically can't give you cash. They can only give you vouchers. And then we use like a local restaurant in Hallam for the $20 one. And then the $10 one we normally use as like a bar voucher for the football club.
That's fantastic. A whole range of different approaches to sponsorship, which is really great. Anyone else? Any other comments or any other examples of engaging and keeping sponsors? By all means, whilst Bowen Lockyer moving through, if you want to put them in the chat.
From the Berwick Footy Club.
Hey, Peter, how you going?
Yeah, good. We actually started a coterie group about 5 or 6 years ago because we found we just weren't raising enough money through sponsorship and just the business side of the footy club. So we tapped into a load of local guys who were existing sponsors or ex-players who had businesses and then their networks. And now we've actually got a group of about just over 50 guys, I think it is, or 50 people this year that all are part of what we call the Wiconians, like the Carltonians and the Essendonians. That's where we stole the idea from. And they are a network that we have 3 functions a year to the sort of 3 major home games that we play. And we wine and dine them. It's all part of their membership. They can bring guests along as well. So it's helped us raise money just from those functions. But it's also enabled us to tap into a network of business people who can help supply other sponsors, friends of theirs or suppliers of theirs, and also services and equipment we might need. It's just a good, well-funded, well-connected network that we send emails out to and we get help through. So it's not only just money, it's also support in other ways as well.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think when we talk about even from a governance perspective or looking for ways to get some skills within your club, it's another way when you talk about in-kind support, and there are sometimes limits around it, but sometimes instead of funds going straight to the club, you can use potential sponsors or people connected with your club for them to provide their skills. And a great example is if you're looking for particular skill sets on your committee or you're looking for assistance in an area, rather than the club having to actually outlay the cash if they don't have it available, using those particular people to say, look, we can put signage up, we can promote your business through Facebook, through social media, in exchange for some assistance in particular areas. And then that's another really good way that you can potentially look to engage sponsors and use that in-kind support without it purely being just cash in the door.
Yeah, great. And thank you everyone for the input. Yeah, that was really good to hear different avenues people have been, I guess, going down in terms of alternative revenue streams and engaging with their sponsors. So the next slide. So I've got, I just wanted to touch on now, I guess, so we've sort of covered off in terms of financial sustainability. We've spoken about some alternative revenue streams. Now, I guess I just wanted to touch on just monitoring how we are going in terms of our financial sustainability and monitoring the performance of the club, financial health of the club. So some key areas that I wanted to chat through was just around regular internal financial reporting. And what that looks like for a club, some cash payments and receipts, and just how we can put some controls in place just around what cash goes out the door and how cash comes in the door, as well as minimum internal financial controls. So as Locke touched on earlier, having 2 people sign off on transactions, reviewing bank reconciliations, just to provide the committee overall just with a bit more, I guess, assurance as to the financial numbers that have been presented to them. Because a lot of feedback we had with clubs was generally the committee doesn't have much oversight in terms of the operations or the financial operations of the club. They really rely on that treasurer function. And I mean, it puts a lot of burden on the treasurer to try and explain the numbers to the committee. So I guess this will just provide them with that ongoing communication. So, it provides them comfort with what's going on within the club. So the first point was just around regular internal financial reporting. So on the screen there, I've just got a copy of what we mean in terms of a financial report. So this is something that would just be tabled within the committee. And generally we would recommend that people table these on at least a quarterly basis. Generally it's we sort of table it in line with the club season. So if the club operates 2 seasons where we go through summer and winter, then generally be on a quarterly basis. If we're only operating on a 6-month season, then generally probably every 2 months we'd have a look at these reports. And now the quality of the report really depends on, I guess, the sophistication of the club. So if you're using any cloud-based accounting software, generally these reports can be run off quite easily. It's just literally at the click of a button. It's just a matter of updating the budget within the software, and then you can run these reports off. So on the screen here, we've got, I guess, this is just a dummy example of a club, but effectively what we're doing is we've got our budget figures in there for the quarterly versus actuals budget. And you can see there, anything with a cross means it's an adverse, I guess, adverse outcome compared to budget. So, you know, we haven't hit our bar sales for the period. Purchases, they may be up or down. Generally, if purchases are up, we'd expect sales to be up because we're acquiring all that stock. And then we monitor the other costs as well. So insurance, advertising, if there's any general expenditure, we would monitor those. So when we're looking at this, generally there would be reasons associated with like any sales being down. So, you know, clubs will have an understanding of their club, particularly the committees. So, you know, if we've had periods of lockdown, generally you would see falls against our budget. For clubs, the key things to monitor when we are looking at these on a regular basis is just what that spend is looking like. And it's going to be just around those things like particularly general expenditure or any costs that weren't budgeted. Because that's generally where, so if there aren't many controls within a club, that's generally where you can pick up on things that, you know, might be going awry. So, you know, money going out the door that the committee hasn't authorised or, you know, isn't within budget. So that's generally a touch point for where we would ask some questions. And then in terms of this financial reporting, so we've got two options here. So quarterly actuals versus budget is one option. If your club's currently not preparing a budget, the other alternative is just to prepare an actual versus prior year. So you can still monitor, I guess, a metric for the club so we can see how we're comparing to last year. Generally with the club, you know, if we haven't had a large increase in membership numbers or our costs are generally the same each year, then we'd sort of be tracking, if we're not expecting much growth within the club, we'd sort of be tracking to prior year at least. So you can sort of use that as your base metric in lieu of not having a current budget in place. But again, just to reiterate, yeah, these financial reports, I know a lot of treasurers are operating on a volunteer basis. So, you know, we're not expecting clubs to put in place anything too whiz bang. It's just more something that's fit for purpose for the club that can, you know, easily summarize how the club's going on, how it's financially performing within a given period. So there was a few points coming, or a few questions I think coming in. Did anyone have any questions just on the financial reporting, or if there's any examples of clubs that do currently have financial reporting capability within the club, or anyone that's currently using Xero that might yeah, be able to shed some light in terms of how they're using that reporting capability? No, that's all right. Well, I'll continue on. If there's any questions, please feel free to chuck them in the chat box, and we'll get to them when we have our questions at the end. But the next point I wanted to touch on was just cash payments and receipts. So the key thing here for clubs is a lot of clubs operate on a cash basis, and that was something that was definitely evident when we were having our coaching one-on-one sessions with clubs. It was actually positive to note that clubs that had been transitioning to cloud-based software were sort of transitioning a lot of their facilities to be cashless as well. So they were implementing EFT systems that links to the bank account, and then the bank account linked to their Xero or QuickBooks file, whichever they might be using. So where your club is looking to move to a cashless environment, definitely consider some of those cloud-based softwares out there. And I believe from our recent coaching session we had, I'm pretty sure one of the clubs mentioned that Xero actually offer cheaper rates if you are a sporting club. So the one thing we've got on that slide there was just, we wanted to make a point just around signed declarations. So another control that a lot of clubs hadn't implemented was just getting some of their players to sign off on what's called a statement by a supplier. So where you pay a supplier and they don't have an ABN, there is a requirement that we have to withhold some payment effectively to fund that supplier's tax. So where we get around that is where we have that supplier sign off that what they are doing is for a hobby, and this falls down or comes down to the players. So what they are doing is for a hobby, not for a career. So we get them to sign off on this, and then we get around the withholding requirements. But we just thought it was worth mentioning because it was probably one thing that a lot of clubs hadn't really thought of or put in place. Another point that I had in terms of cash payments was and there was something that was raised by another club and we thought it was quite a good idea, was just around a system of how we use cash. And what they had implemented was, rather than, I guess, selling, things like drinks or sausages or anything like that at the club, what they were selling was effectively tokens, and you would buy X number of tokens and then you would receive the cash. And then, so when someone then wants to, I guess, acquire a sausage, what they would do is go up and use one of their tokens, and then they would get the sausage. And what that basically did was they would then reconcile the number of tokens they'd sold to how much cash they've got, and generally the two should tally up quite close together. So we thought, just as, I guess, in lieu of not having some sort of cashless facilities like EFT, that might be something that clubs could consider implementing, just to sort of mitigate that risk of any cash going or being misappropriated or lost or anything like that. And that's just one way you can, I guess, reconcile cash at the end of the day easily, just by calculating the tokens we have versus the cash we have.
Did you find that, though, I suppose, given that the sale point was at the one location rather than at potentially one at the bar, one at the canteen, one at the gate, that having potentially 3 different sale points increases the risk of cash going missing? Did you find that because it's only one sale point, that's a big benefit for the club?
Yeah, it absolutely does. I mean, you can sort of monitor who's been, taking the cash throughout the day. So some clubs, you could implement a roster system where you are tracking who was on the cash taking. It might just be one area, like you mentioned. But yeah, it does mitigate that risk that the wrong people aren't the ones handling the cash. So that sort of leads into, I guess, the next slide that I just wanted to touch on, was just some of those minimum internal financial controls that clubs can look to implement. And again, just to reinforce, this is to provide the committee a greater level of assurance that what we are presenting in the financial statements is accurate numbers, and we can rely on those numbers. So it's not, I guess, discrediting the work or the integrity of those people that are predominantly have oversight over cash or the financial records. It's more just providing that base level of assurance that everything is up to scratch. So one thing we had was just around inventory management. A lot of clubs during our sessions held large amounts of stock, might have been equipment, rolling machines, that type of stuff, but didn't have any sort of register for monitoring that. Particularly stock that can go missing quite easily, things that can easily be picked up, like cricket bats, pads, all that type of stuff. So just maintaining some sort of register and performing, just could be an annual stock take of that register, just to make sure that nothing is going missing. We're keeping a record of that. Bank reconciliations is the key one. A lot of clubs don't actually perform bank reconciliations or table bank reconciliations at committee meetings. But I guess from our perspective, the bank reconciliation is a key control, and making sure that someone else is looking at that is effectively going to mitigate, I guess, the risk of funds going missing. And where you might have that is, so if we're not looking at the financial statements and we're not comparing budget to actual, then how are we monitoring, what funds are going out the door and whether or not any transactions are being properly recorded within the system? So making sure the bank reconciles and everything's recorded in the P&L will make sure that then that information flows through to the financial reports that the committee's reviewing on an ongoing basis. So that was one of the key controls that we recommend clubs look to implement. And that could be the treasurer performs the bank reconciliation, which he or she is likely doing at the moment, and just tabling that with the committee so they can see quite easily that the bank statement being reported is what agrees to our accounts. Dual signatories for payments was also another key control. So that is a good one for, I guess, making sure that the payments going out the door are actually for the club and the benefit of the club, and B, the payments are within budget and approved by committee. So generally it's one person, or what we've found is generally it's one person within the committee that has authorization to make payments. In some cases there were more than one person, but the bank facility didn't actually require a dual sign-off on transactions. So we do recommend that where clubs don't require dual sign-offs at the moment, to just get that implemented, just so there is at least two eyes going over transactions, particularly large payments that are leaving the club. And again, the final point was one we've already touched on, was just consideration of cloud-based accounting software, and particularly with the linkage to EFT facilities within the club. I mean, the best way to mitigate misappropriation of cash is just by removing it altogether. So having EFT systems where we link that to our bank account and the bank account links to our accounting software is just an easy way for everything to get reconciled. And not only will it reduce, I guess, the risk of cash going missing, but it will also just provide a bit more efficiency in terms of the reconciliation process. Rather than doing those manual reconciliations, we can just do it in a cloud-based accounting software. So was there any questions on that, any of that content? So anything to do with, I guess, the reporting functionality, internal controls? Love to hear from any clubs that have transitioned their club over to cloud-based software, how they've found the transition and if it's actually creating efficiencies within the club. Or even if there's any clubs out there that, you know, the committees have been struggling, I guess, with financial literacy or understanding, you know, how the club is going in terms of its financial viability.
I'll just note a comment that's come through on the chat though. Paris from Hallam Football Netball Club said that they implement 2 areas for cash sales and a roster, and they also have to sign on and record their float and sign off and pop float back and record denominations against what the Square Register is showing. And they also do some monthly stock take of merchandise, canteen and bar. So some really great financial controls there at play, I think.
Yeah, great, perfect. It sounds like you might have an auditor on your committee, Paris.
Any other comments or examples from clubs out there? We've had a couple of clubs as well, Bo and Lachlan, that are using cloud-based software. So we've got Peter that's using Xero, and then that lets us share the certain tasks when required. And obviously Paris has said as well that they use QuickBooks and can generate reports. And there's Paris as the auditor.
There you go. Great. So yeah, I guess that was it in terms of content that we had to go through. We've just popped up here, I guess, some additional resources that clubs can just have a look at in terms of what grants might be available, or, you know, what help is out there, budget templates, all that type of stuff is available. So we suggest, yeah, definitely jumping on and having a look at some of the resources available for clubs. So before we pass on to the City of Casey to take us through the grants, was there any final questions or points that people may have had?
I think all good, and Lachlan and Bo are going to stay on just for another couple of minutes. So if there are any questions that you want to chuck in the chat function, by all means, they can probably answer them just while going through the next part of the session. But just from our side of things, before I hand back to Robert, Bo and Lachlan, thank you very much for presenting the content tonight. I'm sure that the clubs in attendance have got a lot of tips and information for obviously financial sustainability and viability, and the different ways that you can potentially address that. So thanks again, and I'll hand back to Robert.
Thanks, Jesse. Thanks, Bo. Thanks, Lachlan. That was really, really insightful, guys. So I hope everyone's got a lot out of that and at least picked up a few tips or tricks of how they can sort of make their club more financially sustainable. So thank you very much, guys. Perhaps, maybe if possible, if there is a question after tonight that someone thinks of over the next 24 hours or so, we might be able to send that through to you guys if it's hasn't been covered. So if we do get anything, we might sort of send that through. So thank you very much, guys. So moving on, we're lucky enough to have Kristen Sweeney with us as well. Kristen, I hope you're there. You are on the participant list, so
Yep.
you are here. Thank you.
I'm here.
So awesome, thank you. So I'll hand over to Kristen now to talk about Council's grants program and how we can assist clubs from a grants perspective. Over to you, Kristen.
No worries. Thanks, Robert. You'll do the slides for me. I'll just let you know when to move on.
Yeah, I think Jesse or maybe Lockie or Bo will have control of that, and they can do
Great,
that when you need to.
No worries. Thank you. Oh, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here tonight and just have a quick talk to you all about all things grants. So I'm Kristen Sweeney and I work in the grants development team here at Casey Council. So grants are one form of helping the financial sustainability of your clubs, and I'll provide some information on some of Council's grants opportunities and also talk about some things to think about when looking for grant funding to support your program. So I've only got about 10 minutes to chat to you. So I suppose the main thing to note is that you shouldn't be reliant on grants to fund your everyday programs and activities. They should be for additional or new projects or to develop something or improve something that you're already doing. It's really risky to rely on grant funds for ongoing programs because the funds aren't guaranteed from one year to the next. So first I'd like to introduce you to some of Casey's grants opportunities. So if you could just go to the next slide, please. So this equipment and training grants, this is one that we've got opening soon, and this is a real entry-level grant. So the application isn't too complex. There isn't any complicated reporting involved at the end. So it's a really good one to start with if you're new to grant seeking. So this is an annual grant program. It's opening on the 5th of July and closing on the 13th of August. So you've got 5 weeks to submit an application. That's heaps of times. So this is really for equipment to support your operations, and as sports clubs you're going to have so much equipment that you're going to need to buy from year to year. So think of sporting equipment, but also maybe thinking about audio-visual equipment for your coaches, maybe cooking equipment for your kitchen, or if there's anything COVID-19 related that you need to get for your club, there's an opportunity to apply for up to $1,000. The funding is also for training of group members and volunteers, so first aid training, leadership training, coaching, and if there's any COVID-19 related training, you can apply for those equipment and training grants. So hope to see lots of applications there from sports clubs coming up. We normally do have that well supported by sports clubs. So next slide, please. So another popular grant for sports clubs is our annual community grants program, and I recognise quite a few names in the chat of previous applicants from sports clubs. So you probably know all about these. They're offered every year. They're offered at the same time of the year, opening in March and closing in April. So I'm really sorry if you didn't apply this year. You've missed out for this financial year, but don't worry, it'll be open again in March next year. So there's up to $5,000 that you can get for your club. Health and wellbeing is a category, diversity and harmony. So some really great opportunities there for sports clubs. So next slide, please, is our City of Casey Quick Response Grants. So this is one grant that's open all year round. So it's there for you when you need it in an emergency. It has to be something urgent or unforeseen. So something that you can't really plan for or anticipate. Up to $1,000 is available. Clubs can receive 2 quick response grants in a calendar year. And we really try to have a quick turnaround for funds there because we know that if it is an emergency, you're going to need that funding quickly. We try to get it to you within about 10 days. So how much grant money is out there? Well, you might be surprised to know there's about 10 billion available annually in Australia, but you also might be surprised to know that there's about 1.25 million annually available for community grant groups like yourself. So the community grants I just spoke about, there's our funding pools, anything up to $400,000. We have around about 100 and 110 groups applying each year, and normally over 80% are successful in receiving that grant. For equipment and training grants, there's a $100,000 funding pool, and last year 83% of the groups that applied were successful. So the odds are in your favour. If you put in a grant application, you've got a really good chance of being successful for a City of Casey grant. And if you're new to grants, then City of Casey is a really great starting point. Next slide, please. So you've also got a good chance of getting a Sport and Recreation Victoria grant. So the state government often has large amounts of funding to distribute. They've also got a few grant opportunities available all year, like the Emergency Sporting Equipment Grant. So if your club's broken into, if you have a flood or fire, something like that, you can replace your sporting equipment. And they've also got a significant sporting event grant. So keep your eye out for these sorts of grants. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about being grant ready, so that when the funding opportunity does become available, you've got all of the information and resources to hand, and you've thought through your project and consulted your members. So being grant ready is really going to help you immensely when you hear about that a grant's open, and it'll make the application process so much easier and less stressful. So if you've ever been lumped with the responsibility of submitting a grant, you'll know that it can be really stressful and you really feel like the onus is on you to get the grant funds. So the first thing to think about is to have all of the essential documents together and readily accessible. Most grant applications ask for your incorporation number, your public liability insurance, your financial statements, your bank account details, a statement by supplier form, which was spoken about in the previous presentation if you don't have an ABN. So keep all of these ready to go with the most current documents there, and have it in a central place so it's accessible by your committee, even when committee members change. So the next thing is to develop your project ideas. So think about the reason that your group exists, and your vision for the future for your members and your community. So grant application should support and link in with and help your club achieve your vision and mission. So talk to your members now, talk to your committee members now, and think about some projects you want to do and have these ideas grant ready. You can develop the project ideas in terms of looking at a project outline, what you want to do, how you're going to do it, why you want to do it, link it to your club's vision, also align it with the funding body's aims. So in terms of stakeholders, who's involved with the project, which other groups will be involved. Funding bodies love collaborative projects, so get any partners on board early and start those conversations in the quieter times. Look at your target audience, who's going to benefit, and also look at community needs. So why is that project needed? You can gather together some statistics to demonstrate this, and that'll really strengthen your application. And the City of Casey website and the census data is a really great place to start. It's got lots of information about characteristics of the Casey population. So in terms of project budget, what's it going to cost? What are other sources of income, and how can your club contribute? So you need to look at your project plan and timelines. What are all the steps going to be? Be realistic in how long you think it's going to take. Projects always take longer than you think. So if you gather together and keep all of this information there, you can adapt it for different grant applications, and it'll be far quicker than starting everything from scratch. I do have some grant ready templates that I can share with you, so you can get all that information ready. So some common themes for grants and funding is often programs to engage young people, programs for inclusion of people from poor backgrounds, programs for women, anything with a health and wellbeing and a mental health focus, particularly reconnecting post-COVID. So keep these in mind when you're developing your project ideas. So the keys to success really is to develop great projects. Funding bodies rarely give funds for operational costs. They want to fund projects, and that's where you can look at look at the grant projects that you've got grant ready. So share your passion, show how your project aligns with the funding body's priorities, but also how it supports your own mission. And in terms of organisational capacity, talk about your previous experience, the skills of your members and your volunteers. So, I mean, a grant application is kind of like a job application. You're pitching your project in a way that you're going to convince a funding body that your project and your group is worthwhile of being funded. So next slide, please. So just a few practical tips to help your success. So make sure you're eligible. There's nothing worse than spending a whole lot of time applying for a grant only to find out that you're not eligible. Make sure you can meet the requirements. Include all of the required information. So don't make the funding body chase you up for documents. Most of them won't, and you'll go straight into the ineligible pile. Submit early to avoid last minute technical failures. So late applications aren't accepted. And computer and internet problems aren't going to be a valid excuse for missing a closing date. Start to develop a relationship with the funding body. Give them a call. Talk to them about the guidelines and eligibility. It's all making them learn a little bit more about your club. Also, don't assume that the person reading the application has any knowledge of your organisation or the project. So you need to be succinct, share your passion, tell a story if you can, and be interesting, and plan your budget. It was great to hear some talk about planning a budget, because it really is an area that clubs fall down in grant applications. So the next slide, please, is just a very, very simple budget example, but I just wanted to include that because so many groups get this wrong. So for most budget tables, including the KC grant ones, you'll have 2 columns for income and 2 columns for expenditure. You want the total of those two to match up to show that your budget balances. Give as much detail as you can, show where you're going to get some other income from, and detail all of your expenditure. It just helps show the assessors and the funding body that you've really thought through your project in terms of what the finances are going to be, what your organisation can contribute. One more thing to note, that if your organisation is registered for GST, Council will give you the grant funds plus GST. So if you've got, if you get successful for a $5,000 grant, you'll get $5,500 for your organisation. Clubs sometimes don't realise that. And just in finishing up, how do you know where all these grants are available? The previous presenter spoke about having someone at your club be the person that looks out for grants. Well, we actually do it for you. We put out a grants update once a month. So we look at all the council grants, the Sport and Rec Victoria grants, philanthropic trusts. We find grants from foundations that you probably never heard of, but they've got money to share for the right projects. Excuse me. There's a sport and recreation section there. If you just go to the next slide, there's some grants recently that were sport and recreation grants, but don't limit yourself to that. Look in the youth field, look in the disability section, look in the community services section. There's a lot of grants out there. You just need to link up your grant ready project with the funding body's aims. We also have some grant writing workshops. So if you've been given the responsibility to apply for grants and you'd like some more skills, we've got those workshops available. We've got a basics workshop, and then once you've done that, you can do the next level workshop and really give you some skills and confidence in applying for grants. So good luck with your project scoping. Please get yourselves grant ready. Look out for all the Casey grant opportunities that are coming up, and I really hope that we see you at a grants information session soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. Thank you very much for that. That was very insightful. We just had a question, if you don't mind answering. Will the template you spoke of be able to be provided, or can we email that out?
Sure, I can email that out. So I've got a grant ready template to get your organisation grant ready and to develop up some scopes and projects. So I can definitely get that out to email for you.
No worries. We'll send that out to all participants as well as the information on the recording when it's available. So thank you very much for that. I'll just ask, has anyone got any final questions or queries or anything before we finish up for this evening? It's been jam-packed full of information and content, and we thank all of our presenters for attending tonight and providing their expert analysis and opinions and information. But if anyone's got a question, please feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat quickly before we finish up. No, it's okay. No one's able to, or not got anything at the moment. As I said earlier, if you do think of something potentially over the next 24 hours, over the next day or so, and you think, oh, I should have asked that on the night, please feel free to get in contact with us. I'm sure Jesse, Lachlan and Bo are able to answer any questions that may have come up post the session. As I indicated, we'll provide the recording of tonight's session so you can have another view of it or get other people within the club to have a look through it as well as the slide decks from this evening. We'll provide those in the coming few days or in the next week or so once we get that information all packaged up. But I'd just like to once again thank all of our presenters. So thanks, Jesse, thanks, Lachlan, thanks, Kristen, for attending tonight. Janice, did you have a question? You've got your hand raised, Janice. Is that for anything?
You hear me now?
I can now, yep. You're just on mute again, sorry, I think.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, that's it, perfect.
Okay, I'll start again. My club has got a project which is actually to upgrade an existing Casey building, or a small building, put it that way. The question is, would we be best to apply for a grant, or would we be best to go directly to Casey to see whether they can do it with their own engineers and so forth? Because of course, when you apply for a grant, there's a great time lag and you've got to get quotes and all sorts of things. But it's always been a bit tricky for us because we don't know whether we should be going to the Casey people, Casey engineers. Can you answer that?
Can I ask what club or group you involved with?
Yeah, it's a Doveton Tennis Club. I'm the vice president.
Yep. I probably reckon this one might be one to take offline and just discuss exactly what the project requirements are, and then we can maybe identify if it's best to have if we can source a grant through council, if council can look to put a application to a state government grant sort of perspective on your behalf. Did you, Jesse or Lachlan, want to add anything on top of what I've just suggested?
Look, from our side of things, I think that's the best way, and that's what we typically see is just have the conversation initially, and then you can kind of assess the needs and I guess what's going to be the facility used for, that kind of stuff, and can kind of go from there, I think.
Where would we direct our inquiry?
If you want to maybe send an email to leisure@casey.vic.gov.au to start with, and then either myself or one of the other sports officers can get in contact with you, and we can set up a chance to have a chat and discuss it further.
Okay, thank you for your help.
No worries, anytime. Was anyone else?
Just further, I was just going to say, Rob, just further that as well, there's obviously, there are some great grants out there for facilities as well, but we'd always recommend the first starting point is to go to council and at least start the discussion from their side of things. Once you then kind of have that point of reference and see where the next steps are going to need to be, then you can look to go and see if you need to apply for grants. There's some great grants out there that you can look to support that kind of project.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you very much. Okay, well, in finishing, we would hopefully like to try and get some feedback from everyone on how the session went tonight. So we will send around a quick survey probably tomorrow. If you could give us a quick, it should only take about 5 minutes. If you could give us some feedback, we'd just be greatly appreciative. We're continuing to try and ensure we grow these forums so that they are the best they possibly can be, and they can give you the information that you need to continue to grow and service your club as best you can. So if you could do that for us, that would be greatly appreciated. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending. Thanks to our presenters, and enjoy the rest of your evening. We haven't gone too far over an hour and a half, so yeah, enjoy the rest of your night.